Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related ranting and raving, where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can ask us a question yourself. Of course, you can send me a postcard, an email. You can comment on a previous video or podcast. You can even support us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legio, Optio, and Centurion. Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Get a digital copy of the magazine, even a physical copy of the magazine, and the ability to answer questions, ask questions, although, of course, you can ask questions anyway. So, now, this one is from Jack Sarge Painting. Hi, Murray. Do we have enough information to actually describe how the Huns were dressed for war? Did they look much the same as the Goths or other migration-era peoples? Is it a misconception to think that they looked anything like the later Mongols? Did they go in for bright or rich fabrics in their panoply like other warrior cultures? I've heard that they were keen to get their hands on silk. Did they then wear this into battle? Okay, lots of things to unpack there. One is we do get some descriptions of Hunnic dress, but it is in the context of Ammianus Marcellinus, Procopius, and Sidonius Apollinaris. Ammianus 4th century, Sidonius Apollinaris 5th century, and Procopius 6th century. And they're very much centered on describing how weird the Huns are. And to start, I think definitely it's wrong and a misconception to think that they look like the Mongols. They've always turned into proto-Mongols, for lack of a better term, which I don't think is necessarily the case. There's a whole bunch of Hunnic cultures which we don't really know enough about to differentiate: the Kidarites, the Alcon Huns or the Hephtalites, the White Huns, the Hun Huns, the Attila the Hun Huns, the Huni or the Hunna, names that we get for them. The current thinking is that they are a steppe people from the sort of eastern steppes, northwestern China, but it's a tricky one because we don't know. There's some work being done on it, but you've got the Zhong, I hope I'm saying it right, the Zhongnu as a people who appear in the sources early on, who we think these Huns, and there's been work on it since the 18th century about where the Huns come from. The idea that the Great Wall of China is built to repel them, and so therefore that's who they are. There's the Przewalski horse, or the Taki, which seems to be the same horse as the later Mongols, but that seems to be the steppe horse. So any steppe nomad is going to be riding that same horse. So the origin of the Huns is that we think that they come from, essentially, if you have India and you go directly north into the steppes, that's where they sort of originate, for lack of a better term. And then they, in the sort of 2nd century AD, begin migrating westwards. And so what we find is that by the time of the Gothic invasion of the Roman Empire in 376, the Huns are being blamed for putting population pressure on those Goths and pushing them across the Danube. We then get descriptions of the Huns in the army of Fritigern at the Battle of Adrianople. So even early on, there are Huns that are separate from Huns. So there are multiple tribal groups of Huns. And when we talk about Attila, we're talking about the sole king who unifies the Hunnic world under his banner. But prior to that, there's a dual kingship. So both Attila and his brother Bleda had been co-kings, and before them, their uncles Oktar and Ruga had been co-monarchs, which is a very unusual system. And so it's something that even then and after Attila dies in 453, there's evidence that the three sons of Attila try and unite the empire or take a third of the empire each, probably with each of them hoping to unite it like their father did, but that there are even other break-off Hunnic tribal groups who we have named leaders of them. So there's all sorts of groups who are not necessarily a single Hunnic identity. So in that sense, coming back to dress, is there differentiation between Hunnic tribes about hairstyle? We get various sources talking about their misshapen heads, which refers to the skull elongation practices that they had. We get, there's a fascination and abhorrence in the sources about their misshapen skulls and all of this sort of thing. But their bodies are very comely, according to, various sources. We don't know whether they have different dress or colour or those sorts of ideas. So I would imagine that the brown-wearing, fur-wearing Huns that we see isn't as colourful as they would have been. They would have been much more colourful, but we don't get any mention of that colour. But again, the Romans who faced them would have also been very colourful, so it wouldn't have been noteworthy. Having said all of that, we do find Ammianus talking about, this is in book 31 where he starts to talk about the Huns. Now you can take this with a pinch of salt. He talks about how amazing they are as cavalry. Lots of admiration for their ability as cavalry. And remember, of course, Ammianus Marcellinus was a cavalryman, so that's coming from a position of, wow, these guys are good. They wore loosely woven garments. That's not Ammianus, that's Procopius. Ammianus says, they dress in linen cloth or the skins of field mice sewn together. Now, if you think about the size of a field mouse, that's a lot of field mice to make clothing. I don't know that is accurate. They wear the same clothing indoors and out, but when they have once put their necks into a faded tunic, now that's an interesting one, which may suggest that it's dun-coloured rather than bright, it is not taken off or changed until by long wear and tear it has been reduced to rags and fallen from them bit by bit. So there is an idea that they would stay in a single set of clothing for a long time. They cover their heads with round caps and they protect their legs with goat skins. Their shoes are formed upon no lasts and so prevent their walking with a free step, which is another thing about this idea that they spend so long on horseback that they can't walk. They don't know how to walk, which is, of course, silly. But what shoes we have found in several of the tumulus and Kurgan burials seem to support this shoes made without lasts, and the boots. Now, what they wore in terms of armour, probably they would have tunics and padded armour, most of which hasn't survived because of the archaeological record, but they probably had lamellar or scale armour. And according to Procopius, he talks about the armour of the Huns being that the Huns were vulnerable at a place where his body was uncovered above the armpit, close to the shoulder. So it could be armless tunics that they wore. They probably also wore Roman helmets, captured Roman armor and gear, provided that it would be operable on one of their horses. Now, their horses are shorter and smaller than Roman horses, we think. So some of the heavier armor might not have been practicable to be worn by Huns. We then get the 5th century poet Flavius Marobardes talking about the Huns who Aetius hired in 425, that they wore belts, quivers, horse bits, helmets, and armor studded with precious stones. Now, when we look at some of the finds, of course, there's garnets and gold everywhere in a lot of the Hunnic decorations, so probably that's what's being described. And again, those golden garnet decorations would make me think that their clothing would be colourful, not that it would be colourful and that the only thing coloured on it would be these decorations. So you've got that. You've then got decorated with stones in a beaded setting, a style Hunnish metalwork with favoured, and again that looks like what we've got. You've then got Procopius talking about things like the Spangen helms that they wore and things like that. So it would seem that they have clothing which is permanent. They don't have changes of clothing that they wear. We've got these, woven garments, whether we think it's linen or whether we think it's field mice, and tunics as well, and some kind of goatskin, possibly like chaps, I imagine, as a separate piece of clothing to protect trousers or long tunics. You've then got, this idea of armour of all kinds, whether it be lamellar or scale or borrowed or plundered from the Romans, is probably the sources of it. Let me see, did I write anything else when I wrote my Osprey on this Their shaggy legs are covered in the skins of kid goats. That's just the same free phrase translated differently. They were nearly always on horseback, their horses being ill-shaped but hardy, which is criticism of the Taki. But there is not a person in the whole nation who cannot remain on his horse day and night. Yes. And yeah, so there's nothing there about colour. I imagine that, and I'm assuming here, Jack, that you wanted a wargaming answer, you could quite easily make your Huns far more colourful than is normally depicted, not just shades of brown and grey. You could quite easily make them colourful with, they were on the Silk Road after all. So I imagine that you could have all sorts of different colourful fabrics in your Hunnic army. So again, okay, coming back to tactics, what we get from Ammianus, and this is again his description of their battle tactics. They form in a solid body and utter all kinds of terrific yells. They are very quick in their operations of exceeding speed and fond of surprising their enemies. With the view to this, they suddenly disperse, then reunite, and again, after having inflicted vast loss upon the enemy, scatter themselves over the whole plain in irregular formations, always avoiding a fort or an entrenchment. Now, the interesting thing here is that the term that Ammianus uses is kuneus, which means wedge. But kuneus is not a tactic of a wedge, which it is a word that can mean that, but it's also just a group. And so later in the Notitia Dignitatum, we get the description of various cavalry units described as kuneus, kuneus being a group of horsemen. And so it would seem that tribally or sub-tribally or familiarly on the battlefield, this single line of Huns, which we get from Maurice, I think, divide just all of a sudden without any order or signal as far as the Romans can tell. And they race off all over the place, and then they reunite to deliver a devastating charge, which again is very admirable in terms of its horsemanship. But the idea of the kuneus being a grouping, we don't know how those kunei organized. Although having said that, there's a poem about the Battle of Nadao. Oh, have I got that open? I haven't got that open. Maybe I have. No, I haven't. There's a poem which he describes a Hunnic organization for hundreds and thousands. Now, bizarrely, there's not 100 and 100, and there's not 1,000 and 1,000. But he talks about these 16 different divisions of Huns on the battlefield, which is fascinating if it's accurate. So I've probably diverged from your question. Sorry, Jack. We don't have enough information, but I imagine that they were far more colourful than they're generally depicted. They probably look different from the Goths. One of the problems we get with Roman sources is they can't tell the difference between the Suebi and the Quadi and the Marcomanni, but the Suebi, the Marcomanni, and the Quadi could. So from a Roman perspective, they all just look the same, but from their perspective, they probably had differentiations of dress or decoration that they could have easily identified where that person was from, hairstyle, those sorts of things. Is it a misconception to think that they looked anything like the later Mongols? I think so, yes. Did they go in for bridal rich fabrics in their panoply? I would say highly possible, probable even that they did. And I hope that answers your question. Join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.